On Christmas morning 1989, 3 children disappeared from a small town in rural Pennsylvania while their parents slept. No signs of struggle, no ransom demand, no bodies ever found. For 35 years, their fate remained a mystery wrapped in holiday cheer and unspoken dread. But when a demolition crew tears down an abandoned church in 2024, they discover something hidden in the walls, something that suggests the children never left town at all. What really happened on that Christmas morning? And why did an entire community choose to forget? If you're fascinated by true crime mysteries and unsolved disappearances, subscribe now. You won't want to miss how this ends. The snow fell thick and silent over Millbrook, Pennsylvania, on Christmas Eve, 1989. Main Street twinkled with colored lights strung between lampposts, and wreaths hung on every shop door. The Methodist Church bell tower rose above the town square, its white steeple pointing toward a gray sky heavy with winter. Inside the rectory beside the church, Reverend Thomas Whitmore sat alone in his study, the only light coming from a small desk lamp. His hands trembled as he wrote in a leather journal, his pen scratching urgently across the page. Outside his window, he could see families hurrying home through the snow, arms laden with last-minute gifts. Children laughed and called to each other, their voices muffled by the thick blanket of white covering the ground. The Reverend paused, staring at what he had written. Then, with a sudden violence that made the lamp flicker, he tore the page from the journal, folded it carefully, and placed it inside an envelope. He sealed it with wax, pressing his signet ring into the warm, red pool. For a long moment, he held the envelope, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or curse. He stood and crossed to the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the study. The fire had burned down to embers, but he could still feel its heat. He should burn the envelope, he knew. Destroy the evidence of what he knew, what he had seen. But his hand would not obey. Instead, he walked to the far wall and ran his fingers along the wooden paneling until he found a specific board. It came loose easily, revealing a hollow space behind the wall. He placed the envelope inside, replaced the board, and stepped back. The church bell began to toll midnight. Christmas Day had arrived. Reverend Whitmore returned to his desk and picked up his pen once more. But this time, his hand was steady as he wrote a different kind of message. One that would be found on his desk the next morning when he failed to appear for Christmas service. A message that would raise questions but provide no answers. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering tracks and secrets alike. The demolition crew arrived at the old Methodist church on a Tuesday morning in March 2024. The building had stood empty for 15 years, ever since the congregation merged with the Baptist church across town and moved to a newer facility. The stone structure had deteriorated badly, its roof partially collapsed, windows broken by vandals and time. The town council had finally voted to tear it down and turn the lot into a small park. Marcus Webb stood at a safe distance, watching the excavator's mechanical arm swing toward the church's east wall. He was the site supervisor, a man in his 50s who had demolished dozens of old buildings across 3 counties. Nothing about this job seemed unusual to him, just another decrepit structure that had outlived its purpose. The excavator's bucket struck the wall with a grinding crash. Stones tumbled, dust billowed, and the wall began to collapse inward. Marcus had seen this happen 100 times, but what he hadn't seen before was his operator, Danny Chen, suddenly shutting down the machine and climbing out of the cab with a white face. "Boss," Danny called, his voice tight. "You need to see this." Marcus approached, annoyed at the interruption. They had a schedule to keep. But when he reached the partially demolished wall, he understood why Danny had stopped. Through the settling dust, Marcus could see into a hollow space that had been sealed inside the wall. And there, arranged carefully on a wooden shelf, were 3 small pairs of shoes. Children's shoes, old and dusty, but still intact. Beside them sat 3 small backpacks, the kind elementary school kids might carry. "Don't touch anything," Marcus said quietly, pulling out his phone. I'm calling the police." While they waited, Marcus moved closer, careful not to disturb the scene. The hollow space was perhaps 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, built deliberately into the wall's structure. The shoes were arranged neatly in a row, a pair of red sneakers with white laces, a pair of worn brown boots, and a pair of small white church shoes with a buckle. Each pair was small, sized for children no older than 10 or 11. The backpacks were faded and covered in dust, but he could still make out cartoon characters on 2 of them. The third was plain blue canvas. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March wind. This wasn't random trash that had somehow gotten sealed in a wall. This was deliberate. This was a hiding place. 2 patrol cars arrived within 15 minutes, followed shortly by a white sedan. A woman in her 40s stepped out, her badge clipped to her belt. Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to Danny, had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 20 years. She approached the wall with the careful attention of someone who understood that scenes like this could change everything. "Nobody's touched anything?" she asked, pulling on latex gloves. "No, ma'am," Marcus confirmed. "We saw it and called immediately." Sarah stepped through the gap in the wall, using her flashlight to examine the hollow space. She photographed the shoes and backpacks from multiple angles before carefully lifting the first backpack, the one with cartoon characters. She unzipped it slowly. Inside were school papers, a lunchbox, and a small toy car. She turned one of the papers toward the light. At the top, in a child's careful handwriting, was a name, Tommy Patterson. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had lived in Millbrook her entire life. She knew that name. Everyone in town over a certain age knew that name. "Get the state police on the phone," she said to one of the patrol officers, "and find out if Captain Morrison is still alive." The officer looked confused. "Morrison retired 20 years ago, Detective." "I know," Sarah replied, still staring at the name on the paper. "But he was lead investigator on a case in 1989. 3 children who disappeared on Christmas Day. Their names were Tommy Patterson, Rebecca Oakes, and Michael Chen." Danny, the excavator operator, made a small sound. "Chen? That's my family name." "I know," Sarah said softly. "Michael was your uncle. You never met him because he vanished when he was 9 years old, 6 months before you were born." She carefully examined the other 2 backpacks, confirming what she already knew she would find. Personal belongings of Rebecca Oakes and Michael Chen. 35 years after they disappeared, their possessions had been found sealed inside a church wall, placed there deliberately, hidden with care. "Why would someone hide their things here?" Marcus asked. "And where are the children?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was staring at something else she had noticed, a small gap at the back of the hollow space. She shone her light into it and saw that it opened into a larger void, a space that ran down behind the wall toward the church's foundation. The light didn't reach the bottom. "We're going to need a forensics team," she said, "and we're going to need to take down the rest of this wall very carefully. I think there's more down there." As her team began securing the scene, Sarah stepped away to make phone calls. Her first was to the state police. Her second was to the 3 families who had spent 35 years wondering what happened to their children. As she dialed the first number, she looked back at the church. The building had stood here for over 100 years, a place of worship and community gathering. But now she wondered what other secrets it had kept, sealed behind its stone walls, hidden in the darkness where no one thought to look. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the demolition site. Workers stood in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Everyone in Millbrook over the age of 40 remembered Christmas 1989. The day had become a scar on the town's memory, something people mentioned in whispers or avoided discussing altogether. 3 children vanished without explanation, their faces on missing posters that yellowed and faded but never came down. And now, after 35 years of silence, the church was finally beginning to speak. Linda Patterson stood at her kitchen window, washing the same plate for the 3rd time without realizing it. She was 71 now, her hands marked with age spots, her hair completely white. But her eyes were the same sharp blue they had been 35 years ago when she last saw her son Tommy. The phone call from Detective Chen had come 2 hours ago. Linda had listened in silence, her grip tightening on the receiver until her knuckles went pale. They found something at the old church. Tommy's backpack, his belongings. After the detective finished speaking, Linda had thanked her calmly and hung up. Then she had walked to the kitchen and begun washing dishes, the only thing she could think to do with her shaking hands. Her husband Robert sat at the kitchen table behind her, his face buried in his hands. He had been retired for 6 years, but the news had aged him another decade in minutes. Their daughter Claire stood in the doorway, her own eyes red from crying. She had been 13 when Tommy disappeared, old enough to remember everything, old enough to never stop missing her little brother. "We should go down there," Claire said quietly. "To the church." The detective said to wait, Robert replied, his voice hollow. "They're still processing the scene." Linda finally set down the plate and turned to face her family. They found his things, but not him. That means there's still no answer, just more questions. "At least it's something," Claire insisted. "More than we've had in 35 years. Linda crossed to the table and sat heavily in her chair. The kitchen around her was filled with memories of Tommy. The height marks on the door frame where they had measured him every birthday. The refrigerator that had once displayed his drawings, now covered with photos of grandchildren he would never meet. The empty space at the table where he should have sat for thousands of meals, but never did. "I need to call Margaret," Linda said, reaching for her phone. "She needs to know before she hears it somewhere else." Margaret Oakes had been Linda's closest friend since they were teenagers. They had raised their children together, celebrated birthdays and holidays together. And on Christmas Day 1989, they had watched their worlds collapse together when they realized their children were gone. The phone rang 4 times before Margaret answered, her voice cautious. "Linda, you heard? Detective Chen called me an hour ago. I've been sitting here trying to understand what it means." Linda pressed her palm against her forehead, fighting back tears. "It means someone took their things and hid them in that church wall. Someone who knew where our children were. Or what happened to them," Margaret added softly. They were both silent for a moment, the weight of 35 years of grief settling between them like snow. "Do you remember Reverend Whitmore?" Margaret asked suddenly. Linda frowned. "Of course. He disappeared the day after Christmas, left a note saying he needed to go on a spiritual journey, and no one ever heard from him again." The detective asked me about him specifically, asked if Tommy or Rebecca ever mentioned him, if they spent time at the church. "Tommy was in the Christmas pageant that year," Linda said, her mind racing back through decades of memory. "He was supposed to be a shepherd. They had rehearsals at the church every Wednesday night in December. Rebecca too," Margaret confirmed. "She was an angel in the pageant." Linda stood abruptly, energy suddenly coursing through her. "I need to find something. I'll call you back." She hung up and hurried upstairs to the spare bedroom, the one that had been Tommy's room and remained essentially unchanged since 1989. She had moved some of his things to storage, but many items remained, frozen in time like a museum dedicated to a 9-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs and baseball. She opened the closet and pulled down a cardboard box labeled Tommy's School Papers, 1989. Inside were spelling tests, math worksheets, and drawings. She sorted through them carefully until she found what she was looking for. A program from the Christmas pageant, printed on cheap paper that had yellowed with age. The front showed a drawing of the church with snow falling around it. Inside was a list of participants. Linda scanned the names until she found Tommy's. Shepherd, Tommy Patterson. Below his name was Rebecca's, Angel, Rebecca Oakes. And further down she saw, Wise Man, Michael Chen. All 3 missing children had been in the Christmas pageant. All 3 had been at the church for rehearsals in the weeks before they disappeared. And Reverend Whitmore had been directing the pageant. Linda's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and took a photo of the program. She sent it to Detective Chen with a message. All 3 children were in the Christmas pageant, rehearsals at the church. Reverend Whitmore was in charge. The response came quickly. "Can you come to the station tomorrow morning at 9, bringing in the other families too? We need to go through everything from 1989. Linda looked around Tommy's room, at the faded posters on the walls and the toys gathering dust on the shelves. For 35 years, she had maintained this space, unable to let go, unable to move forward. She had been frozen in time just like these belongings, waiting for answers that never came. Now, finally, the ice was beginning to crack. She didn't know what they would find beneath it, but anything was better than the eternal winter of not knowing. She returned downstairs, where Robert and Claire waited anxiously. "They want us at the station tomorrow morning," she told them. "All 3 families. They're reopening the investigation." Robert stood and wrapped his arms around her. They held each other in the kitchen where they had held each other so many times before, on anniversaries of the disappearance, on Tommy's birthday each year, on Christmas mornings that arrived with cruel regularity. But this time felt different. This time they were not just holding each other through grief. They were holding each other through something new, the terrifying possibility of truth. Outside, the March afternoon was fading into evening. Across town, in 3 separate houses, 3 families were having similar conversations, feeling similar emotions. The wound that had never healed was being reopened, and nobody knew whether what lay beneath would bring healing or only deeper pain. At the demolition site, portable lights had been set up as forensic technicians continued their careful excavation. Detective Chen stood watching them work, her coat pulled tight against the evening chill. They had widened the opening in the wall and discovered that the hollow space did indeed extend downward. What they found at the bottom would determine everything that came next. A young technician emerged from the gap in the wall, his face pale in the harsh, artificial light. "Detective, you need to see this." Sarah followed him back through the opening, descending a temporary ladder into the space beneath. The hollow area was larger than she had expected, a deliberately constructed chamber about 6 feet square. Her flashlight swept across the space, revealing more items carefully arranged on makeshift shelves. 3 small blankets, folded neatly. 3 plastic cups, a deck of playing cards, a flashlight with dead batteries, and carved into the stone wall, barely visible beneath decades of dust, were 3 sets of initials: TP, RO, MC. Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a hiding place for belongings. This was a place where children had been kept. The blankets, the cups, the playing cards. These were items for living, not dying. Someone had imprisoned these children here, in a chamber beneath the church, close enough to the surface that they might have heard the organ playing and the congregation singing, yet utterly hidden from view. "Get ground-penetrating radar out here," she ordered. "I want to know if there are any more hollow spaces in this foundation. And get me everything we have on Reverend Thomas Whitmore. Every record, every document, every photograph. I want to know everything about the man who ran this church in 1989. As she climbed back out of the chamber, her phone buzzed with a text from Captain Morrison, now 83 years old, but still sharp as ever. "Heard the news. I'm coming down tomorrow. There are things about that case you need to know. Things I couldn't prove back then." Sarah looked back at the church, its Gothic architecture looming against the darkening sky. The building had seemed noble and peaceful when she was a child, attending services with her parents. Now it looked sinister, its empty windows like blind eyes, its tower reaching up like an accusing finger. Somewhere in or beneath this building were the answers to what happened on Christmas Day, 1989. And Sarah suspected that when they finally uncovered the truth, it would be darker than anyone in Millbrook had ever imagined. The Millbrook Police Department conference room smelled of old coffee and anxiety. Detective Sarah Chen had arranged chairs around a long table, placing boxes of tissues at intervals along its length. She knew from experience that conversations like this one would need them. The three families arrived within minutes of each other at 9 o'clock sharp. Linda and Robert Patterson came first, their daughter Claire between them like a bridge connecting two people who had drifted apart over decades of shared grief. Margaret Oakes arrived alone, her husband having passed away 8 years earlier from a heart attack that Margaret always said was really caused by a broken heart. David and Susan Chen came last, David moving slowly with a cane, Susan's face carefully composed in the way of someone who had learned to mask pain as a survival skill. They took their seats slowly, these people who had once been close friends but had gradually separated, unable to bear the weight of each other's sorrow on top of their own. Sarah noticed how they avoided eye contact at first, then slowly began to acknowledge each other with small nods and sad smiles. "Thank you all for coming," Sarah began, remaining standing at the head of the table. "I know this is difficult, but we need to go through everything from the beginning. The discovery at the church has given us our first real evidence in 35 years, and I believe we finally have a chance to learn what happened to Tommy, Rebecca, and Michael." She opened a laptop and projected an image onto the wall, a photograph of the hollow chamber beneath the church, showing the arranged belongings, the blankets, the carved initials. Linda Patterson gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Margaret Oakes began to cry silently. David Chen's face turned to stone, while Susan gripped her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. "We believe the children were held in this chamber," Sarah continued gently. "The items we found suggest they were alive there for some period of time. We don't yet know for how long or what ultimately happened to them, but we're conducting extensive forensic analysis." "You're saying someone kept them prisoner under the church?" Robert Patterson's voice shook with barely controlled rage. "For how long?" "We don't know yet, but we're going to find out." Sarah advanced to the next slide, showing the Christmas pageant program that Linda had sent her. "All three children were involved in the church Christmas pageant. Tell me about the rehearsals." Margaret spoke first, her voice thick with tears. "They started in early December, every Wednesday evening at 6 o'clock. The children were so excited about it. Rebecca practiced her lines every night at dinner. Tommy too," Linda added. "He took it very seriously. Said Reverend Whitmore told them they were doing God's work." "How did the children seem during those rehearsals?" Sarah asked. "Did they ever mention anything unusual? Anyone who made them uncomfortable?" The families exchanged glances. Finally, Susan Chen spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael had nightmares in December. 3 or 4 times he woke up crying, but he wouldn't tell us what they were about. He just said he dreamed about the church." Sarah leaned forward. "Did you ask Reverend Whitmore about it?" "We did," David Chen confirmed. "He said it was normal for children to feel anxious about performing in front of people. He seemed concerned, asked if Michael wanted to drop out of the pageant. But Michael insisted he wanted to stay in it." "Tell me about Christmas Eve," Sarah said. "The last time you saw your children." The room fell silent. This was the memory they had all revisited 1,000 times, searching for clues they might have missed, details that could have changed everything. Linda spoke first, her voice distant as she traveled back through time. "Tommy went to bed at 8 o'clock. We had a tradition of opening one present on Christmas Eve, and he'd chosen new pajamas, red flannel with snowflakes. He was so excited about Christmas morning. We read him a story, kissed him goodnight, and closed his door." She paused, swallowing hard. "When we checked on him at 7 the next morning, his bed was empty. The window was open. There were no footprints in the snow outside because it had snowed again overnight, covering everything." Margaret nodded. "Same with Rebecca. She went to bed at 8:30. We heard her moving around in her room until about 9, then silence. When I went to wake her up Christmas morning, she was gone. Window open, curtains blowing in the cold air." "Michael's window was open too," Susan confirmed. "We thought he'd run away at first. He'd been having those nightmares, and we wondered if he'd been sleepwalking. But there was something strange we noticed later. Something that never made sense. Sarah waited, her pen poised above her notepad. His winter coat was still in the closet, Susan continued. His boots were by the door. If he left on his own, he went out in his pajamas and bare feet, in the middle of a snowstorm. What child would do that? Unless they didn't leave willingly, Sarah said quietly. Unless someone took them. She pulled out 3 evidence bags from a box beside her chair. Inside each bag was one of the backpacks found in the church wall. I need you to look at these carefully. Tell me if you notice anything that wasn't there before, anything that seems wrong or out of place. She passed the bags around the table. Linda took Tommy's backpack first, her hands trembling as she examined it through the clear plastic. This is his, she confirmed. These are his school papers, his lunchbox, but... She frowned, peering closer. There's something wedged in the side pocket. I can see a corner of paper. Sarah nodded. We found notes in all 3 backpacks, hidden in places where a casual search might miss them. We've dated the paper and analyzed the handwriting. They were written by the children, approximately 2 to 3 weeks after they disappeared. The room erupted in gasps and questions. Sarah held up her hand for silence. The notes are brief and difficult to interpret. They seem to have been written under duress, possibly with someone watching, but they provide our first direct evidence of what happened after the children were taken. She pulled out photocopies of the 3 notes and passed them around. Tommy's note read, "The shepherd watches the flock in the dark place. I count the stones, 37 on my wall. He brings bread and water. He says we are special. He says we must be patient. The angels will come soon." Rebecca's note was similar. "I am the angel, but there is no light. Tommy counts stones. Michael draws pictures. We sleep when the bells ring. He makes us pray with him. He says we are chosen for something important." Michael's note was the longest. "I drew the chamber today. It is shaped like a cross. We each have a corner. The shepherd and the angel are across from me. He teaches us songs about heaven. He says our parents did not deserve us. He says we belong to God now. I miss my mom." Margaret Oakes was sobbing openly now, her whole body shaking. Linda and Susan clung to each other across the table. The men sat in stunned silence, their faces reflecting horror and rage. "The shepherd, the angel, the wise man," Claire Patterson said suddenly. "Those were their roles in the Christmas pageant." Sarah nodded. "We believe Reverend Whitmore took the children and kept them in that chamber under the church. The references to bells ringing suggest they could hear the church services. The bread and water indicates he was feeding them. But what happened after these notes were written, we still don't know." "You said the pageant was on Christmas Eve," David Chen said slowly, his mind working through the timeline. "The children disappeared that night, after the pageant had already happened. Why would Whitmore take them then? The pageant was over." Sarah pulled out another document. "I've been reviewing the program. The Christmas Eve pageant was actually just a rehearsal for the full performance, which was scheduled for January 6th, Epiphany. The real pageant never happened because the children were missing and Reverend Whitmore had disappeared. He planned this," Robert Patterson said, his voice hollow. "He chose them for those specific roles. He took them after the rehearsal because he had everything ready. The chamber, the supplies, whatever twisted plan he had." "We're operating on that theory," Sarah confirmed. "Captain Morrison is coming in this afternoon. He was the lead investigator in 1989, and he says there are things about Reverend Whitmore that he couldn't prove at the time but always suspected." She advanced to another slide showing a photograph of Thomas Whitmore. He was a man in his mid-50s with thinning gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a gentle face that would have inspired trust. He wore the black shirt and white collar of his profession and stood before the church, smiling benignly at the camera. "Did any of you know him well?" Sarah asked. "He seemed like a good man," Margaret said softly. "He'd been at the church for about 3 years when the children disappeared. He visited the sick, helped the poor, gave beautiful sermons. Everyone liked him." "That's what makes people like him so dangerous," Sarah replied. "They hide in plain sight, using positions of trust and authority to access victims." She closed the laptop and sat down, facing the families directly. I need to prepare you for what we might find as this investigation continues. The forensic team is excavating beneath the church foundation. Ground-penetrating radar has indicated several more hollow spaces. We may find remains. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. These families had spent 35 years in a strange limbo, unable to grieve properly because they had no bodies, no certainty, only absence and questions. The possibility of finally having answers was both a relief and a terror. Whatever we find, Sarah continued, whatever truth emerges, I promise you that we will see this through to the end. Your children deserve that. You deserve that. As the families filed out slowly, supporting each other, sharing tissues and quiet words, Sarah remained at the table, looking at the photograph of Reverend Whitmore. Behind that gentle smile and those kind eyes had lurked something monstrous, and she was going to prove it. Captain James Morrison arrived at the police station at 2 o'clock, moving slowly but with the deliberate purpose of a man who had never really retired in his mind. At 83, he was thin and stooped, his face a map of wrinkles, but his eyes remained sharp and clear. Sarah met him in the lobby and was struck by how tightly he gripped her hand when they shook. 35 years, he said without preamble. 35 years I've waited for this day. They settled in Sarah's office rather than the conference room, a smaller space that felt more appropriate for the conversation they needed to have. Morrison lowered himself carefully into a chair and pulled a worn leather briefcase onto his lap. From it, he extracted a thick folder, its edges soft with age and handling. This is my personal file on the case, he said, setting it on Sarah's desk. Everything the official investigation missed, everything I couldn't prove, everything that kept me awake at night for decades. Sarah opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, photographs, and what appeared to be surveillance logs. You kept investigating after the case went cold. I never stopped. Morrison's voice was firm. Those 3 families deserved answers, and I knew we had missed something. I just couldn't figure out what. He reached across and pulled out a photograph from the middle of the stack. It showed Reverend Whitmore standing with a group of children, all wearing choir robes. The photo was dated 1987, 2 years before the disappearances. Whitmore came to Millbrook in 1986, Morrison began. He told the church council he'd been serving at a small parish in western Pennsylvania and wanted a change. His references were excellent. His background check came back clean. The congregation loved him immediately. But something bothered you about him, Sarah prompted. Morrison nodded slowly. Nothing I could put my finger on at first, but after the children disappeared and he vanished the next day, I started digging into his past more carefully. That's when things got strange. He pulled out another document, a photocopy of a newspaper article from 1982. The headline read, Church Fire Claims 3 Lives in Harrisburg. The parish where Whitmore supposedly served before coming to Millbrook burned down in 1982, Morrison explained. 3 children from the congregation died in that fire. It was ruled accidental, faulty wiring in the basement. But I went to Harrisburg and talked to the fire investigator. He always thought the fire was set deliberately, but he couldn't prove it. And here's the interesting part. The 3 children who died were all in the church choir. They had been at choir practice when the fire started. Sarah felt a chill run through her. Whitmore was running the choir? He was the assistant pastor at the time. The investigation found no evidence linking him to the fire, and the pastor who died in it had a much stronger motive. He was having financial troubles and had taken out a large insurance policy on the building. But I tracked down some of the other choir members, now adults, and asked them about Whitmore. Morrison pulled out handwritten notes from what appeared to be interviews. 2 of them told me that Whitmore used to talk about sacrifice, about how God sometimes called certain children to be special vessels of grace, about how suffering purified the soul and prepared it for heaven. Did you share this with the state investigators? Of course I did. But it wasn't enough. Theological discussions aren't evidence. The fire was ruled accidental, and Whitmore had a solid alibi for Christmas Eve. He was at the church rectory, preparing for Christmas Day service. Multiple people saw lights on in his study until late that night. Sarah frowned. But the rectory is connected to the church. If he had the children in that underground chamber, he could have been moving between the rectory and the church without anyone knowing. Exactly what I thought. So I searched every inch of that church and rectory, looking for evidence of a connection, a hidden passage. Anything. I found nothing. He paused, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The day after Christmas, Whitmore's study was found empty except for a note saying he needed time for spiritual reflection and was leaving on a retreat. His personal effects were gone. His car was gone. We issued a nationwide alert, but Thomas Whitmore vanished as completely as those 3 children. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing this information. So you believed he took them, but you couldn't prove it, and you couldn't find him. I believed he took them, kept them somewhere and did something to them, but I couldn't figure out where. I searched that church, Sarah. I had dogs go through it. We examined every closet, every storage room, every basement corner. We never thought to look inside the walls. The chamber was too well hidden, Sarah said. Whoever built it knew exactly what they were doing. It would have taken careful planning, probably weeks or months of construction. Morrison pulled out another document. This one, a building permit. In the summer of 1989, 6 months before the disappearances, Reverend Whitmore requested permission to do some foundation work in the church basement. Said there were water damage issues that needed addressing. The church council approved, and he hired a contractor to do the repairs. Do we know who the contractor was? A man named Gerald Voss. One-man operation, did odd jobs around the county. I interviewed him twice after the children disappeared. He said he'd reinforced some foundation walls and installed better drainage. Everything seemed legitimate. He died in 1997, car accident. Sarah made notes. So Whitmore could have used that renovation as cover to build the hidden chamber, have someone do legitimate foundation work, then seal off a section for his own purposes. That's my theory, but here's what really kept me up at night. Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping. 4 months after the children disappeared, I got an anonymous letter. No return address, postmarked from Pittsburgh. I've kept it all these years. He pulled a plastic evidence sleeve from the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed text. The shepherd guards his flock in the house of God. They sing for him where no one can hear. He believes he is saving them from a corrupt world. Look deeper into the foundation of faith. A witness. A witness, Sarah repeated. Someone who knew what Whitmore was doing, or someone who was helping him. I investigated every angle. I drove to Pittsburgh and canvassed churches, showed Whitmore's photo around. Nothing. The letter was a dead end, but it confirmed my suspicions. Someone knew the children were in that church. Sarah studied the letter carefully. The language was specific, almost biblical in its phrasing. The shepherd guards his flock. That's what Tommy wrote in his note. Whitmore called himself the shepherd. And he made those children think they were special, chosen, classic abuser pattern. Isolate them, control them, make them dependent on you for everything, even food and water. But then what happened? Sarah asked. When did they die? How? And where are their bodies? Morrison's face grew grave. That's what we need to find out. The chamber where they were kept is too small to have held 3 growing children for very long. Either he moved them somewhere else or... He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the forensic team at the church site. She read it and felt her stomach drop. They found something. We need to go. The sun was setting as they arrived at the church, painting the old stone building in shades of orange and red that seemed ominous rather than beautiful. The forensic team had set up more lights and erected a tent over the section of wall they were excavating. The lead forensic investigator, Dr. Patricia Wong, met them at the entrance to the tent. We used the ground-penetrating radar as you requested, she said, her face professionally neutral. There are 3 more hollow spaces in the foundation, each one approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, the dimensions of a grave. "We've opened the first one," Dr. Wong continued. "I think you need to see this before we proceed with the others." They followed her into the tent and down a temporary stairway that had been constructed to access the foundation level. The excavation had revealed a section of wall with a bricked-over opening. The bricks had been carefully removed and stacked nearby. Dr. Wong shone a high-powered light into the opening. Inside, clearly visible against the dark earth, was a small skeleton, curled in a fetal position. Beside it were the remnants of clothing, red flannel fabric with a pattern that might once have been snowflakes. "Tommy," Sarah whispered. "The bones show signs of malnutrition," Dr. Wong said quietly. "And there's evidence of healed fractures in the left arm and 2 ribs, suggesting abuse. But the cause of death appears to be suffocation. The space is too small and too well sealed for adequate air circulation." Morrison had to sit down on the steps, his face gray. He sealed them in. After keeping them alive in that chamber, after making them think they were special, he sealed them into those walls and let them suffocate. "We'll open the other 2 spaces tomorrow," Dr. Wong said. "But I think we can assume we'll find Rebecca and Michael." Sarah climbed back up the stairs, needing fresh air. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky. 3 families were about to receive the news they had waited 35 years to hear, and it was the worst news imaginable. Their children had been alive, imprisoned beneath the church they had trusted, and they had died slowly in the darkness while the congregation sang hymns above them. She pulled out her phone to call Linda Patterson, but her hand shook so badly she had to try 3 times before she could dial the number. This was the part of the job no one prepared you for, the moment when you had to destroy hope with truth. As she listened to the phone ring, Sarah looked back at the church one more time. Tomorrow they would find Rebecca and Michael. Tomorrow they would confirm what everyone now suspected. But the question remained, where was Reverend Thomas Whitmore? Had he lived with his crime for 35 years, or had he escaped into death beyond justice? The news spread through Millbrook like a winter plague. By morning, every resident knew that the remains of Tommy Patterson had been found sealed in the church wall, and that 2 more bodies would likely be discovered within hours. The town seemed to hold its collective breath, suspended between grief and horror. Sarah Chen had not slept. After making the calls to the 3 families, after hearing Linda Patterson's wail of anguish that would echo in her nightmares forever, she had returned to the station and begun searching for Thomas Whitmore with renewed urgency. He was no longer just a missing person or a suspect. He was a confirmed killer, and she needed to find him. At 8 o'clock, Dr. Wong called. They had opened the second hollow space. Rebecca Oakes had been found in the same condition as Tommy. Skeletal remains, evidence of prolonged malnourishment, remnants of an angel costume from the Christmas pageant. The third space yielded Michael Chen, his small bones still wearing the tattered remains of clothing from a wise man's costume. The 3 children had been entombed in the walls of the church, each one sealed into their own tiny grave, left to die in darkness while wearing the costumes they had been so excited to perform in. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. Sarah sat at her desk, staring at Reverend Whitmore's photograph, memorizing every line of his face. Captain Morrison had returned to the station and sat across from her, his old hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. "The question now is whether he's still alive," Morrison said. "He would be 91 years old." "People live to 91, Sarah replied, "especially people who've spent 35 years believing they got away with murder." Her computer chimed with an incoming email from the FBI. She had sent Whitmore's photo and information to their database overnight. The response made her sit up straight. "Morrison, look at this." The email contained a series of flagged incidents from across the country, all involving churches and missing children. None had been definitively connected, but the pattern was striking. A fire in Ohio in 1995 that killed 2 children who sang in the church choir. A disappearance in Montana in 2001. A single child who vanished after serving as an altar boy. Another fire in Nevada in 2008, this time claiming 4 young victims who had been in a church youth group. "He's been moving," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. "Different states, different churches, but the pattern is the same. Children involved in religious activities, deaths by fire or disappearance, and in each case, an assistant pastor or visiting minister who left shortly after the incident." Morrison leaned closer to read the screen. "Do they have names for these ministers?" Sarah clicked through the files. "Thomas Wright in Ohio, Timothy Moore in Montana, Theodore Walsh in Nevada. Different names, but look at the initials. TW, same as Thomas Whitmore." Morrison's jaw tightened. "He's been hiding in plain sight, using variations of his real name, moving from place to place, continuing to kill. The FBI never connected them because they happened years apart in different states, and the deaths were attributed to different causes. But now that we know what to look for..." She began typing rapidly, composing a message to the FBI agent who had sent the file. Her phone rang. It was Dr. Wong again. "Detective, you need to come back to the church. We've found something else." When Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, the forensic team had expanded their excavation to include the area beneath what had once been the Reverend's study in the rectory. The building's interior had been largely destroyed by weather and time, but the foundation remained solid. Dr. Wong led her to a section where they had removed several stones from the floor. "We found a hidden compartment under the study," she explained. "It was sealed with a stone that matched the floor perfectly, but the radar picked up the hollow space beneath." They had erected lights around the opening. Sarah knelt and looked down into a space about 4 feet deep. Inside was a leather-bound journal, remarkably well preserved in the dry environment, and beneath it, a metal box. "We haven't touched them yet," Dr. Wong said, "waiting for your approval." Sarah nodded, and 2 technicians carefully extracted both items. The journal was thick, its pages yellowed but intact. The metal box was locked, but a small key had been taped to its underside. Sarah pulled on gloves and opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise. "The Journal of Thomas Whitmore, Servant of God, Keeper of the Pure." Her hands trembled slightly as she turned pages, scanning the entries. What she read made her stomach turn. Whitmore had documented everything, not as confessions of crime, but as records of holy work. He believed he was saving children from a corrupt world, purifying them through isolation and suffering, then releasing their souls to heaven before they could be tainted by sin. The entries about Tommy, Rebecca, and Michael were chillingly detailed. He described selecting them for their spiritual purity and innocence. He wrote about the Christmas pageant as a testing ground, where he could observe which children were most deserving of salvation. He documented building the hidden chamber during the foundation repairs, describing it as a holy space removed from the corruption of the world. The entries continued after the children were taken. Whitmore recorded their days in the chamber, their prayers, their tears, their gradual weakening. He wrote about teaching them hymns and making them memorize Bible verses. He described their transformation as they became weaker and more compliant. And then, in January 1990, a final entry about each child. "Today, the shepherd joined his flock in eternal peace. His purified soul has ascended." Similar entries for the angel and the wise man followed days later. Sarah had to close the journal for a moment, fighting nausea. Whitmore had documented murdering 3 children and convinced himself it was holy work. Morrison had been reading over her shoulder. "The metal box," he said quietly. "Open it." Sarah used the key to unlock the box. Inside were identification documents for various identities, all with Whitmore's photograph, Thomas Wright, Timothy Moore, Theodore Walsh, and a dozen others. There was also a current passport for Theodore Winters and a small address book with locations listed by state. "He's been planning this for decades," Sarah said. "Multiple identities, multiple locations. He can move whenever he wants, establish himself in a new church, and start again." She flipped to the back of the address book. The last entry was dated 3 months ago. "Blessed Heart Church, Spokane, Washington. Assistant pastor position confirmed. Sarah's phone was in her hand immediately, calling the FBI contact. I need you to coordinate with Spokane Police. We have a location on Thomas Whitmore. He's using the name Theodore Winters and working as an assistant pastor at Blessed Heart Church. Consider him extremely dangerous, likely planning to harm children in the congregation. Within the hour, federal agents and Spokane Police surrounded the church. Sarah watched via video conference as they entered the small brick building. The sanctuary was empty, as was the office. But in a storage room behind the altar, they found something that made Sarah's blood run cold. 3 small cots, 3 sets of handcuffs attached to the wall, and a shelf stocked with minimal food supplies. He was setting up again, she whispered. He's been there 3 months, and he was preparing to take more children. The search of the church revealed that Theodore Winters had not been seen for 2 days. The head pastor reported that Winters had mentioned going on a brief personal retreat. His apartment was empty, his car gone. Sarah slammed her hand on the desk in frustration. He knew we found the chamber. It's been all over the news. He ran. But Morrison was studying the video feed from Spokane with narrowed eyes. Look at the storage room again. Tell them to check behind that shelf on the north wall. The agents moved the shelf and found exactly what Morrison expected. A bricked-up section of wall that had recently been disturbed. Behind the bricks was another hollow space. This one empty but clearly prepared. He was going to do it again, Morrison said. Same pattern, same method, but this time we found him first. Sarah issued a nationwide alert for Theodore Winters, aka Thomas Whitmore. His photo was sent to every police department, every border crossing, every airport. The FBI's most wanted list was updated. But she knew from experience that a man who had evaded capture for 35 years would not be easy to find. Her phone rang again. This time it was the Spokane Police with news that sent electricity through the investigation. We found his car. It's parked at the bus station. We're reviewing security footage now. An hour later, they had it. Clear video of an elderly man matching Whitmore's description purchasing a bus ticket. The destination made Sarah's heart sink. Millbrook, Pennsylvania. He's coming back, she said to Morrison. After 35 years, he's coming home. Morrison's face was grim. He wants to see his work. Killers like him, they can't resist. He needs to know if we found the children, if we understand what he did. Sarah immediately contacted the Millbrook police chief and arranged for additional security at the church site and protection for the 3 families. She also requested that state police set up checkpoints on major roads into town. As she made arrangements, her mind raced through the implications. Whitmore was 91 years old and probably not in the best health, but he was clever and determined. He had evaded capture for more than 3 decades, killed at least a dozen children across multiple states, and had been preparing to kill again. He would not give up easily. The bus from Spokane would take 3 days to reach Pennsylvania, with multiple transfers. That gave them time to prepare, but it also meant 3 days of not knowing exactly where he was or what he might do. Would he stay on the bus, or would he slip away at one of the stops and disappear again? Sarah pulled up the bus route and began calling police departments in each city where the bus would stop. She sent Whitmore's photo and warned them to watch for him, but she knew that an elderly man traveling alone would not attract much attention. He had become invisible through age, just another senior citizen that people glanced past without really seeing. That night, Sarah sat in her office long after everyone else had gone home, studying the journal entries. Whitmore's handwriting remained steady and precise throughout, showing no doubt or remorse. He truly believed he was doing God's work, saving children from sin by imprisoning and killing them. The psychology of it was deeply disturbing. Whitmore had convinced himself that he was righteous, that the suffering he inflicted was purification, that the deaths he caused were release. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as a savior. Sarah's eyes fell on one particular entry from February 1990, a month after the children had died. I have left Millbrook as planned. The vessels have been sealed in holy ground, their souls released to heaven. The town grieves, but they do not understand the gift that was given. Perhaps someday they will see the truth. Until then, God's work continues elsewhere. She closed the journal and looked at the photograph of Whitmore on her computer screen. In 3 days, possibly less, he would arrive in Millbrook. And when he did, Sarah would be waiting. This time, Thomas Whitmore would not escape. This time, the shepherd would face judgment for his flock. The town of Millbrook transformed into something it had never been, a place of constant vigilance. State police cruisers patrolled the streets. Plainclothes officers watched the bus station, the train depot, and the major intersections. The 3 families were under protection, their homes monitored 24 hours a day. And at the church site, where forensic teams continued their grim work, armed officers stood guard. Sarah had not left the station for more than a few hours at a time in 3 days. She tracked the bus carrying Theodore Winters, Thomas Whitmore, across the country, coordinating with local police at each stop. In Seattle, an officer had boarded and confirmed that an elderly man matching the description was indeed aboard, sitting quietly in a window seat, reading a Bible. "He's still on the bus," Sarah reported to Morrison, who had taken up semi-permanent residence in the station's conference room. "ETA to Millbrook is tomorrow morning at 6:15. Morrison nodded slowly. "He'll get off that bus. He wants to see what we found. He probably thinks he can talk his way out of it, or that God will protect him. Men like him always believe they're untouchable." The next morning arrived cold and gray, with fog rolling through the streets like something from a Gothic novel. Sarah positioned officers around the bus station, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes. She wanted Whitmore to feel safe enough to disembark, but surrounded enough that he couldn't run. At 6:10, the bus pulled into the station. Sarah watched from inside the terminal building, her hand resting on her service weapon. The passengers began to exit. A young woman with a backpack, a businessman with a briefcase, a mother with 2 children. And then, moving slowly with a cane, an elderly man descended the bus steps. He wore a long dark coat and a gray fedora. His face was deeply lined, spotted with age, but his eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses were sharp and alert. This was Thomas Whitmore, 35 years older but unmistakably the man from the photographs. He paused at the bottom of the steps, breathing in the cold air of his former home. Then he smiled, a small, satisfied expression that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Thomas Whitmore," she called out, stepping forward with her badge visible. "I'm Detective Sarah Chen with the Millbrook Police Department. You're under arrest for the murders of Tommy Patterson, Rebecca Oakes, and Michael Chen." 4 officers moved in from different directions, surrounding him. Whitmore made no attempt to run. Instead, he looked directly at Sarah, with those sharp eyes, and spoke in a voice that was surprisingly strong for a man his age. "You found them, then? My flock. I wondered if you ever would." "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Sarah ordered. Whitmore complied slowly, still smiling. "You think you understand what I did, but you don't. You can't. You're too bound by earthly thinking." Sarah handcuffed him herself, making sure they were tight. "You murdered 3 children. There's nothing else to understand." "I saved 3 souls," Whitmore corrected gently, as if teaching a particularly slow student. "I released them from the corruption of this world before sin could take root. They're in heaven now, pure and perfect. They died slowly, sealed in walls, suffocating in the dark," Sarah said, her voice hard. "You documented it in your journal. You watched them weaken and die, and you called it holy work." Whitmore's smile widened slightly. "You read my journal. Good. Then you know the truth of it. Those children were special. Their parents didn't deserve them, couldn't protect them from the evils of the world. I gave them purpose. I gave them eternity." Sarah fought the urge to respond, to argue with his twisted logic. Instead, she guided him toward the waiting police car. But as they walked, Whitmore continued talking, his voice calm and conversational. "I've been doing God's work for 40 years, Detective. Those 3 were not my first, and they would not have been my last if you hadn't interfered. How many souls do you think I've saved? 20? 30? I've lost count of the angels I've released to heaven. You're confessing to multiple murders, Sarah said, signaling to an officer to record this. I'm sharing the truth of my ministry, Whitmore corrected. In Ohio, I saved 2 young voices from the choir before sin could silence them. In Montana, a boy who served at the altar with such devotion, I preserved that devotion forever. In Nevada, 4 souls released in holy fire, and there have been others, so many others. They reached the police car. Sarah opened the back door, but before she could guide Whitmore inside, he turned to look back at the town square. His gaze settled on the church in the distance, partially demolished but still standing. I want to see it, he said suddenly. The church, my church. Before you lock me away, I want to see where my flock rested. Absolutely not, Sarah replied. But Morrison, who had been listening from a few feet away, stepped forward. Let him see it, he said quietly. With supervision, under complete control, but let him see it. Sarah looked at the old captain, understanding immediately. Whitmore would confess everything if they gave him what he wanted. One last look at the scene of his crimes, one last moment of control. And they needed those confessions, needed him to provide details about the other victims, other locations. Fine, she said, but you make one wrong move, say one wrong word, and we're done. Understood? Whitmore nodded, that small smile still playing at his lips. They drove the short distance to the church, arriving just as the morning fog was beginning to lift. The building looked even more ominous in person than it had from a distance, its partially demolished walls like broken teeth against the gray sky. Sarah and 2 other officers escorted Whitmore from the car. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on his cane, but his eyes were bright with something that looked disturbingly like joy. They walked toward the excavation site, where Dr. Wong and her team had erected a tent over the area where the children's remains had been found. The chamber where you kept them, Sarah said, pointing to the exposed foundation. We found it exactly as you left it. The blankets, the cups, the carved initials. Whitmore nodded, his eyes distant. They were comfortable there, safe from the world. I brought them food and water. I taught them prayers and hymns. They understood toward the end what I was giving them. They were terrified, Sarah countered. They wrote notes begging to go home. They counted stones on the walls to pass the time. They were children, and you tortured them. I prepared them for salvation, Whitmore insisted. His voice had taken on a preaching quality, rising and falling with practiced rhythm. Their bodies were temporary vessels. What mattered was their souls, and those I kept pure. Morrison had been watching him carefully. Now he spoke for the first time. The fire in Harrisburg in 1982. The 3 children who died. That was you, wasn't it? Your first time. Whitmore's attention shifted to Morrison, and recognition flickered in his eyes. Captain Morrison, you never stopped looking for me, did you? I could tell, even from a distance, that you understood I was different, special. You're not special, Morrison said flatly. You're a serial killer who hid behind religion. I'm a shepherd who guided his flock to paradise, Whitmore replied. And yes, Harrisburg was my awakening. I realized then what God wanted me to do. Those 3 children in the choir, they were so innocent, so pure. And I could see how the world was beginning to corrupt them, how their parents were failing them. The fire was meant to take only them, to release only their souls. But the pastor interfered, tried to save them. His death was unfortunate but necessary. Sarah was recording everything on her phone, held discreetly at her side. Every word Whitmore spoke was another piece of evidence, another confession. Tell me about Montana, she prompted. The boy who served as an altar boy. Whitmore's eyes grew distant with memory. Jacob, such a devout child. He believed in God with his whole heart. I couldn't let the world take that faith from him. I kept him for 3 months in a basement beneath the church rectory. We prayed together every day. When it was time, I gave him communion one last time, then helped him breathe his last breath. It was peaceful, sacred. You suffocated him, Sarah said. I released him, Whitmore corrected gently. There's a difference, if you have the spiritual understanding to see it. They stood in the cold morning air, this old man calmly confessing to decades of murder, framing each death as an act of love. Sarah felt rage building in her chest, but she kept her voice level, professional. She needed him to keep talking. Nevada, she said. 4 children in a fire. How did you choose them? They were in the youth group I led. 2 boys, 2 girls, ages 8 to 12. Perfect ages before adolescence could corrupt them. I'd been preparing a special place for them in the church basement, a room where they could be together, safe from the world. But the head pastor became suspicious, started asking questions about why I spent so much time alone with the children. I realized I had to act quickly. He paused, his expression almost wistful. The fire was beautiful. I locked them in the basement room first, made sure they were comfortable, told them we were playing a special game of hide and seek. Then I started the fire upstairs and left. They never suffered from burns, you understand. The smoke took them gently while they slept. They died terrified and in pain, Morrison said, his voice shaking with controlled fury. Every single child you killed died in fear and agony. For the first time, Whitmore's smile faltered slightly. You don't understand. You can't. You're not chosen for this work. You're right, Sarah said. We don't understand how someone could hurt children and call it love. We don't understand how you could watch them suffer and feel righteous. But we understand justice. And you're going to spend whatever time you have left in prison, knowing that everyone sees you for what you really are. Not a shepherd, not a savior, just a monster who hurt the most vulnerable people he could find. Whitmore's face hardened. I want to see where they rested, where my flock was sealed. Sarah nodded to Dr. Wong, who lifted the tent flap. They guided Whitmore closer to the excavated wall sections where the 3 hollow spaces had been opened. The remains had been removed for analysis, but the small chambers were still visible, each one barely large enough for a child's body. Whitmore stared at the empty spaces for a long moment. Then, to everyone's horror, he began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle but built into full laughter, the sound echoing off the church walls. You think you've won, he said between laughs. You think you've stopped me, but you haven't. My work continues. Those children are in heaven, free from sin, eternally pure. And others I've saved are there too, waiting. I've spent 40 years building a flock in paradise. What have you built, detective? What legacy will you leave? Sarah had heard enough. She grabbed his arm and began pulling him back toward the police car. But Whitmore resisted, his laughter fading into something more, sinister. There are more, he said quietly. More chambers, more churches, more resting places you haven't found. I've traveled across this country, detective, and I've left my mark everywhere I went. You found these 3. You'll find some others, but you'll never find them all. Then you're going to tell us, Sarah said. You're going to give us every location, every name, every detail. Whitmore smiled again. That gentle teacher's smile that must have put so many children at ease before he hurt them. Perhaps. Or perhaps I'll take those secrets with me to the grave. Let's see how persuasive you can be, detective. Let's see if you can convince a 91-year-old man who's already bound for prison to cooperate. What do you have to offer me? What could you possibly give me that would be worth betraying my life's work? Sarah realized with sinking certainty that he was right. He had nothing to lose and everything to gain by staying silent. The only leverage they had was the hope that his narcissism, his need to be understood and appreciated for what he believed he'd accomplished, would override his self-preservation instinct. She made her decision. We'll make sure everyone knows your story, she said. We'll document every detail, every child, every location. Your name will be remembered. As a monster, Whitmore finished. As you deserve, Sarah confirmed. But at least you'll be remembered. Or you can stay silent, and you'll just be another forgotten old man who dies in prison. Your choice. They locked eyes. This young detective and this ancient killer engaged in a battle of wills. Finally, Whitmore nodded slowly. Take me to the station. I'll tell you everything. but I want it written down properly, recorded accurately. My work deserves that much respect." As they drove away from the church, Sarah looked back at the building one last time. 3 children had died here, entombed in walls while their parents searched desperately for them. And those 3 were just a fraction of Whitmore's victims. How many more families were still searching? How many more empty graves were waiting to be found? She would find them all. She had to. It was the only way to honor the memories of the children who had trusted a shepherd and found a wolf instead. The interrogation room in the Millbrook Police Department was small and windowless, painted an institutional beige that seemed designed to encourage confession through sheer dreariness. Thomas Whitmore sat on one side of the metal table, his cuffed hands resting calmly before him. Across from him sat Sarah Chen and Captain Morrison, with 2 FBI agents standing against the back wall. A video camera in the corner recorded everything. Sarah had spent the previous night preparing for this moment, reviewing everything they knew about Whitmore's pattern, his psychology, his need to be seen as righteous. She understood now that he would only cooperate if he could maintain the narrative that he was a savior rather than a killer. It sickened her to play along, but 30 or 40 families deserved answers about their missing children. "Let's start at the beginning," Sarah said, her voice professionally neutral. "Before Millbrook, before Harrisburg, where did this start for you?" Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant with memory. "I was 23 years old, studying at a seminary in upstate New York. I wanted to serve God, to help people. But I could see how corrupt the world was becoming, how children were being raised without proper moral guidance. I prayed for understanding, for purpose." He paused, his wrinkled hands folding together. "Then I met a child named Daniel. He was 7 years old, the son of one of the seminary professors. Such an innocent soul, so full of faith. But his parents were allowing him to watch television, to be exposed to secular music, to attend public school where he would learn about evolution and other lies. I could see the corruption beginning to take hold." "What did you do?" Morrison asked, though his jaw was tight with tension. "I saved him," Whitmore said simply. The seminary had an old chapel that was rarely used, with a basement that had been sealed off for safety reasons. I reopened it, made it comfortable. I told Daniel we were playing a special game, that he was going to help me with important church work. He trusted me completely. Sarah's stomach turned, but she kept her expression neutral. "How long did you keep him there?" 3 weeks. I brought him food and water, taught him advanced prayers, read him scripture. I wanted him to understand what was happening, to embrace his purification, but children don't always comprehend spiritual matters. Whitmore's expression grew distant. On the 20th day, I held a pillow over his face while he slept. It was peaceful. He never woke up. His soul was released directly to heaven, bypassed all the corruption that would have claimed him. "Where did you bury him?" Sarah asked. "In the woods behind the seminary. I marked the spot with a small cross made from twigs, but I'm sure it's long gone now. The seminary itself closed in 1975. The land is probably developed by now." Sarah made detailed notes. The FBI agents were already on their phones, coordinating with New York authorities to search the old seminary property. She moved forward, chronologically. "After Daniel, how long before the next one?" 2 years. I had left the seminary by then, couldn't bear to stay after what had happened. I took a position as a traveling minister, filling in at churches that needed temporary help. In Ohio, I met a girl named Sarah. He smiled slightly at the coincidence of the name, who sang in the church choir. 8 years old, voice like an angel. I kept her for a month in a storage room behind the organ pipes. No one ever thought to look there. When her time came, I gave her communion wine mixed with sleeping pills. She fell asleep singing a hymn. The confessions continued, methodical and horrifying. Whitmore recounted each victim in detail. Their names, their ages, where he had kept them, how he had killed them, where their bodies were hidden. He spoke without emotion, as if reciting a grocery list rather than describing decades of murder. A boy in Michigan, drowned in a baptismal font and buried beneath the church floorboards. Twin girls in Texas, kept in a storm cellar behind a rural chapel for 6 weeks before being poisoned with carbon monoxide. A teenager in Illinois who had resisted, requiring Whitmore to strangle him with his bare hands. Each story was worse than the last, each detail another nightmare. Sarah's hand cramped from writing, but she didn't stop. Beside her, Morrison had gone pale, his breathing shallow. The FBI agents took turns leaving the room when it became too much, but Sarah forced herself to stay, to hear every word, to bear witness for the families who deserved answers. Harrisburg, Morrison said finally, his voice hoarse. 1982. The fire that killed 3 children and the head pastor. Tell us the truth about that. Whitmore's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been genuine regret flickering across his face. That was the only time I made a mistake. I had been at that church for 3 years, the longest I'd stayed anywhere. I had identified 3 children from the choir who were perfect candidates for salvation. I had prepared a space in the church basement, reinforced to withstand fire. He paused, rubbing his temples. My plan was to start a small fire in the church office, enough to cause evacuation and confusion, while I sealed the children in the basement room. The fire would be contained, put out quickly, and in the chaos, no one would notice the children were missing until much later. By then, I would have completed the purification process and moved them to their eternal rest. But the head pastor, Reverend Marcus Webb, he was working late that night. When the fire started, he went looking for people who might still be in the building. He found the children in the basement before I could seal them in. He was trying to lead them out when the fire spread faster than I had anticipated. The old wiring in the building, the wooden construction, it all went up so quickly. Whitmore's voice actually wavered. All 4 of them died in the fire before they could escape. The children weren't purified properly, weren't prepared. It was chaotic, painful, not the peaceful release I had intended. That's when I realized I needed to be more careful, more methodical. No more fires. Individual chambers where I could control every aspect of their transition. So you came to Millbrook, Sarah said. Yes, I took 2 years to plan everything perfectly. I found a church with an old foundation that could be modified. I secured the position as head pastor. I studied the congregation and identified the children who would be worthy. Tommy, Rebecca, and Michael. They were special. I watched them for months before I acted. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. The Christmas pageant was perfect cover. I could spend time alone with them, gain their trust, prepare them spiritually. I built the chamber during the foundation repairs, exactly as you discovered. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail, including kidnapping them on Christmas Eve. Morrison said flatly. Christmas Eve, yes. The symbolism was important. Christ was born on Christmas to save humanity from sin. I was saving these 3 children on the same holy day. I visited each house after midnight while the families slept. The children knew me, trusted me. I told them there was a special surprise at the church, a secret gift for the pageant children. They came willingly. Sarah's hands clenched into fists under the table. Tommy, Rebecca, and Michael had followed their trusted minister into the darkness, expecting a gift, finding instead imprisonment and death. How long did you keep them alive? She asked. 6 weeks. I wanted them to truly understand their purpose, to embrace their transformation. I conducted daily services with them, taught them about heaven and purity. They were resistant at first, cried for their parents, but eventually they accepted their situation. Children are remarkably adaptable when they have no other choice. They were traumatized, Sarah corrected. They were suffering. They were being purified, Whitmore insisted. And when the time came, I sealed each one in their individual chamber. I gave them sleeping pills first, told them it was communion bread. They fell asleep peacefully, and then I bricked up the openings. It was done with love, with purpose. You suffocated 3 children and called it love, Morrison said, his voice shaking with rage. I released 3 souls into eternity, Whitmore replied calmly. And then I left Millbrook as planned, left my note about a spiritual retreat, and moved on to continue God's work elsewhere. The interrogation lasted 7 hours. By the end, Whitmore had confessed to 37 murders across 14 states spanning 4 decades. Some bodies would never be found. Churches had been demolished. Land had been developed. Locations had changed too much. But at least the families would know the truth. At least the searching could end. As they finally led Whitmore back to his cell, he paused at the door and looked back at Sarah. You think I'm a monster, detective? But in 100 years, when those children I saved are still in paradise, while the rest of humanity drowns in sin, perhaps history will judge me differently. History will remember you as exactly what you are, Sarah replied. A coward who hurt children because they couldn't fight back. Nothing more. For the first time, Whitmore's mask of calm righteousness cracked. His face twisted with rage. You understand nothing. Those children were blessed by my attention, saved by my sacrifice. I'm a shepherd who— You're a murderer, Sarah interrupted. And you're going to die in prison, alone and forgotten, while the children you killed are remembered with love by people who actually cared about them. She turned and walked away, leaving Whitmore shouting after her, his carefully constructed narrative finally shattering. The guards moved in to subdue him as his rants echoed down the hallway. Sarah didn't look back. In the conference room, the 3 families waited. Linda and Robert Patterson, their daughter Claire between them. Margaret Oakes, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. David and Susan Chen, leaning on each other for support. They had been told that Whitmore had confessed, that their worst fears had been confirmed, but that at least now they had answers. Sarah sat down across from them, Morrison beside her. For a long moment, no one spoke. What words could possibly be adequate? We know what happened to them, Sarah said finally. We know where they were, how long they were kept, and when they died. Whitmore has confessed to everything, and his confession will ensure he never sees freedom again. Did they suffer? Linda Patterson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah chose her words carefully. Whitmore claims he kept them comfortable, that he gave them sleeping pills before the end. We have no way to verify that, but the forensic evidence doesn't show signs of violent struggle. They were imprisoned, terrified, and that is suffering. But their actual deaths may have been relatively peaceful. It was a small mercy, perhaps the only one she could offer. Can we bury them now? Margaret Oakes asked. Can we finally put them to rest properly? Yes, Sarah confirmed. The forensic analysis is complete. The remains will be released to you within the week. You can arrange whatever services you feel are appropriate. The families nodded, some crying openly now, others sitting in stunned silence. 35 years of not knowing had finally ended. The answers were terrible, but they were answers nonetheless. As the families left, supporting each other, speaking in quiet voices about funeral arrangements and memorial services, Sarah remained at the table. Morrison sat beside her, both of them drained from the longest day either could remember. 37 children, Morrison said finally. 37 families who lost everything because one man convinced himself he was righteous. We found them, Sarah replied. Not all of them, but most. That's something. Is it enough? Sarah thought about the question. Was it enough to solve a 35-year-old case, to bring a serial killer to justice, to give families closure? She didn't know. Nothing could bring those children back. Nothing could undo the decades of grief and loss. It has to be, she said finally. It's all we have. They sat in silence as the evening darkened outside. Somewhere in the county jail, Thomas Whitmore was being processed into the system that would hold him until his death. Somewhere in Millbrook, 3 families were beginning to plan funerals for children who should have been middle-aged by now, who should have had families and careers and full lives. And somewhere, in 13 other states, Families who had spent decades wondering if they would ever find their missing children were getting phone calls that would change everything, for better or worse. Sarah stood finally, gathering her notes and files. The investigation would continue for months as they worked to verify all of Whitmore's claims and locate as many remains as possible, but the core of it was done. The mystery of Christmas 1989 had been solved. "Come on," she said to Morrison. "Let's go home. Tomorrow we start helping the other families. Tonight, we rest." They walked out of the station together into the cold Pennsylvania night. Above them, stars were beginning to emerge in the clearing sky. Sarah thought about Tommy, Rebecca, and Michael, about Daniel and Sarah and all the others whose names she now knew. She hoped, though she wasn't sure she believed, that they were somewhere among those stars. Finally at peace. Finally free from the monster who had stolen their lives. The Christmas vanishing was over. The shepherd had been caught. The flock could finally rest. 3 months after Thomas Whitmore's arrest, Millbrook held a memorial service in the town square. A new monument had been commissioned, a simple stone marker with 3 names carved into its face: Tommy Patterson, Rebecca Oakes, Michael Chen. Below their names was a single line: "Taken too soon, never forgotten." The entire town attended. Linda and Robert Patterson stood at the front, Claire between them, as the mayor spoke about loss and resilience and the importance of community. Margaret Oakes laid flowers at the base of the monument, her hands no longer shaking as they had for 35 years. David and Susan Chen held each other, finally able to mourn properly after decades of limbo. Sarah Chen watched from a respectful distance, not wanting to intrude on the family's grief. The case had consumed her life for 3 months, but now it was time to step back, to let the families heal without constant reminders of the investigation. Captain Morrison stood beside her, looking older than he had 3 months ago, but somehow also younger, as if a weight had been lifted. "You did good work," he said quietly. "We did it together," Sarah replied. "You never gave up on them. And now they can rest." Morrison gestured to the monument. "It's not enough, but it's something." Across the country, similar services were being held in 13 other towns as families finally laid their children to rest. The FBI had managed to locate remains in 9 of the locations Whitmore had described. The other victims might never be found, but at least their families knew the truth. Thomas Whitmore had been transferred to a maximum security prison in western Pennsylvania. At 91, he was unlikely to live long enough to stand trial for all 37 murders, but he had been formally charged in multiple states. He would die in prison, probably within a few years, and the world would quickly forget him. But the children would be remembered. That was what mattered. As the memorial service concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah noticed a young woman approaching her. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. "Detective Chen, I'm Emma Walsh. My brother was one of Whitmore's victims, in Nevada, in the fire." Sarah extended her hand. "I'm so sorry for your loss. I know it's been many years, but—" 16 years, Emma confirmed. "I was 9 when David died. He was my twin brother. For 16 years my family believed it was just a tragic accident. Then you found Whitmore and suddenly we knew the truth. Someone deliberately killed my brother." "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," Sarah said. "I know it doesn't make the loss any easier." "Actually," Emma said, her voice steady, "it does help. For 16 years, I felt guilty. I had a cold that day and stayed home from youth group. David went alone. If I had been there, maybe I could have warned him, maybe I could have saved him. I've carried that guilt my whole life." She looked toward the monument. "But now I know that nothing I could have done would have stopped Whitmore. He had planned everything. David's death wasn't random, and it wasn't my fault. That knowledge doesn't bring him back, but it does free me from the guilt." Sarah nodded, understanding. Guilt is common among survivors. But you're right, you couldn't have stopped him. No one could have, except by catching him sooner. "Which is why I'm here," Emma said. I'm in graduate school studying forensic psychology. I want to understand people like Whitmore, want to help catch them before they can hurt more children. Your work on this case inspired me. I wanted to thank you." They spoke for a few more minutes before Emma moved on to pay her respects at the monument. Sarah watched her go, thinking about how trauma could destroy or transform. Emma had chosen transformation, had decided to turn her pain into purpose. As the sun set over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the town square, Sarah thought about all the lives that had been touched by Thomas Whitmore's crimes. Not just the 37 children who died, but their siblings, their parents, their extended families. Hundreds of people whose lives had been irrevocably changed by one man's twisted interpretation of righteousness. But those lives hadn't ended. They had continued, had adapted, had found ways to move forward despite the darkness. Linda Patterson had started a foundation to help families of missing children. Margaret Oakes had become an advocate for better church oversight and background checks. David and Susan Chen had established a scholarship fund in Michael's name. The children were gone, but their memories lived on in the good works done in their names. That was justice of a sort, Sarah thought. Not the justice of courtrooms and convictions, though that mattered too, but the justice of remembrance, of ensuring that those short lives had meaning beyond their tragic ends. Her phone buzzed with a text from the FBI. They had found another set of remains in Michigan, a boy named Peter who had disappeared in 1993. Another family would finally have closure. Another funeral would be held. Another memorial would be erected. The work continued. It always would. For every Thomas Whitmore they caught, there were others still operating, hiding behind positions of trust and authority. But Sarah had learned something important from this case. No secret stayed buried forever. Eventually, truth found its way to light. Justice might be delayed, but it would come. She turned to leave the square, but paused one last time to look at the monument. Tommy Patterson, who had loved dinosaurs and baseball. Rebecca Oakes, who had practiced her angel lines at the dinner table. Michael Chen, who had drawn pictures in the darkness and missed his mother. "You're not forgotten," Sarah said quietly. "You never will be." As she walked back to her car, the streetlights flickered on one by one, pushing back the darkness. Behind her, the monument stood solid and permanent, a reminder that even in the depths of horror, memory persisted. Love persisted. And eventually, inevitably, truth persisted. The Christmas vanishing was over, but the lives touched by it would continue, carrying the memories of 3 children forward into a future they never got to see. That was the real ending, Sarah thought. Not Whitmore's arrest or confession, but this, the determination of those left behind to ensure that love, not evil, had the final word. She drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, a town that had lived with a wound for 35 years and was finally beginning to heal. The scars would remain, but scars were proof of survival, evidence that even the deepest cuts could close. 3 children had vanished on Christmas Day, 1989. They had been found 3.5 decades later, not alive as their families had prayed, but not forgotten either. And in the end, perhaps that was the only victory possible against monsters like Thomas Whitmore. To remember, to honor, and to keep going. The shepherd had fallen. The flock was at peace. And life, with all its fragile beauty and persistent hope, continued.